Members of the Official Languages Committee, today I'd like to thank you all, Mr. Theberge, for being with us this afternoon. Pursuant to Orders 111.1, Certificate of Nomination of Raymond Theberge to the position of Commissioner of Official Languages referred to the committee on Thursday, November 30th, 2017. So we are welcoming Mr. Theberge as an individual. He's the nominee for the position of Commissioner of Official Languages. Sir, you have 10 minutes to introduce yourself and to do your presentation, and then you will have an hour and 45 minutes of questions from the committee members. I'd just like to tell you how happy we are to have you with us here today. And as members of this committee, we all have official languages and minority communities at heart, and your answers will be carefully analyzed and brought to our attention. So, Mr. Theberge, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee for receiving me here today and for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself, and so that you can get to know me better and so I can discuss the issues and challenges of linguistic duality in Canada with you. I am honored that I am a nominee for the position of Official Languages Commissioner. It is a crucial position for official languages and the promotion of linguistic duality as a fundamental value of Canadian society. I'd like to share some of my experiences with you. Firstly, I'm from Sainte-Anne-des-Chênes in Manitoba. I'm from a French-Canadian family, because at the time we were French-Canadian. At my home, we always discussed French language education. I remember how my mother was always involved in school board elections, and she tried to recruit enough students to hold a French class, and she participated on an advisory committee for the creation of a French Education Bureau. And this bureau is now at risk of losing its assistant deputy minister position. So we must always, always remain vigilant. The fight for French language education has lasted several generations, and this is still continuing today. Official bilingualism and the Official Languages Act, it was a watershed for my generation. We could feel the excitement in the interest in bilingualism, and in me it raised a certain curiosity, and I decided to study linguistics to better understand the objective of my language, and which was at the heart of my identity and a central value for me. When I went back to Manitoba, the Bilodeau case started negotiations between the French Manitoban Society and the provincial government with regard to an amendment to Section 23 of the Manitoba law. Against this background, I became the director of the Société Franco-Manitobaine. Agreement was ratified by the community, and once this agreement became known, there was great opposition to this agreement. And suddenly, Manitoba faced a linguistic crisis that lasts for several months. The government took a step back, and there were public hearings in Anglophone communities, and there were threats to Francophone rights in our community. And finally, the government abandoned its project, and the Bilodeau case went up to the Supreme Court of Canada. I'm reminding you of these events because this was the start of my professional background that was always focused on the understanding and the advancement of official language communities as a professor, as a researcher, as an administrator, and even as a public servant.
Is one of the tools that we have to inform language policy. During the 80s and 90s, I had the privilege to be involved in numerous research projects individually and collectively with colleagues from across the country. We investigated various aspects of ethno-linguistic vitality, bilingualism, language learning, and other topics. The result is the existence of a rich and robust evidence base to guide language policy development. During this time, beyond academic conferences, I was asked to give countless talks on language-related topics to community groups, parent groups, and stakeholder groups. Parents were seeking assurances about the language of instruction and its impact on student success, Francophone and French immersion parents alike. The courts have also relied on research findings and expert witness testimony to arrive at their decision. Je suis actuellement de recherche sur les minorités linguistiques.
I'm currently the chair of the Institut Canadien de Recherche sur les Minorités Linguistiques, which also cooperates with the Quebec Research Institute into English-speaking communities.
Language education in 2 provinces located in Anglophone departments was more often than not to provide an understanding of the realities and aspirations of the Francophone community to colleagues, deputy ministers, and ministers. The expectation of the community is that you would defend and promote those policies and initiatives that advance French language education. Also, in both instances, I was given the responsibility for French as a second language programs. Un exemple d'un projet communautaire issu.
One example of this is the Francophone University in Ontario. I was asked to head the first expert group responsible for responding to the needs of post-secondary education in South and Southwestern Ontario. Today, a bill has been tabled in the House. As president of the University of Moncton, I conducted a large consultation with members of the university community, both Francophone and Acadian, to draft the first strategic plan for the university. During my mandate, the university adopted its first academic plan, increased its research revenues, established a complaints commissioner position, and modernized governance and transparency mechanisms. University of Moncton is a key player in Canadian and international Francophonie. Nearly 20% of our student population comes from abroad, and this university is able to evolve and better meet the needs of its population.
Changing the face of minority language communities in Canada is the arrival of international students and French-speaking immigrants from Africa, the Maghreb, and other French-speaking countries. International students have contributed to enrich student life on campus and in the community. Immigration is one of the keys to the continued vitality of minority language communities. But our communities have to be open and willing to embrace newcomers who speak French, but who do not necessarily share the same patrimoine. This trend brings together the themes of diversity and linguistic duality. How do we manage such change? Are communities prepared to accommodate? Où sommes-nous par rapport?
Where are we with respect to the objectives of the Official Languages Act? Quebec's Anglophone minority and Francophone communities outside of Quebec are different. But there are some factors that they have in common, such as socio-demographics, immigration, early childhood education, technology, and these affect their development. There has been progress in education and health on the legal front, but the evolving nature of the social context, which means that linguistic duality will always be at the heart of the Canadian Federation. There are still challenges, and that's why we must reaffirm linguistic duality as a priority of the federal government. Today, we're at a key point in history. We're waiting for the next action plan on official languages, and the modernization of the OLA is underway with public services at stake, and the Mendelssohn Board B working group is still having a hard time using French as its working language. Finally, the Official Languages Commissioner's last report is quite eloquent with regard, and it only has one recommendation, and here it is. With the approach of the 50th anniversary of the OLA, the Official Languages Commissioner recommends to the Prime Minister and the Treasury Board and the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Minister of Justice to evaluate the Act with regard to how the position is in 2009.
I fully intend to speak truth to power, because when you believe in something, it means taking a risk. It means standing up for something, and that is the role of the Commissioner. Humbly, I do believe that I have what it takes to carry out the work of Commissioner. My depth of knowledge of the issues and the challenges related to linguistic duality speaks in part to why I am the right person to take on the role of Commissioner and tackle those challenges within the mandate of the office. I have also demonstrated my leadership qualities in a number of organizations, academic, government, and community. Si vous me faites l'honneur de me confier cette
If you do me the honor of giving me this responsibility, I will continue the commitment of previous commissioners to defend, protect, and promote linguistic duality as a fundamental value of Canadian society. Thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Theberge, for your presentation. And now we're going to start with questions. I'd like to tell you right from the start that our objective is to determine your qualities and your skills for this position. Before we move ahead, I'd like to consult the various members of the committee to see if we'd be ready to accept at the end of the question period. We allow the Bloc Québécois to ask a question. Is there unanimous consent for this? Yes? Okay, great. So we'll start now with Madame QC for the first question. Thank you. Mr. Theberge, thank you for being here today, and congratulations on your nomination. Of course, we're going to start with the Albertan. That's me.
Official languages functions to protect the French language. I don't think that's a surprise when I say that. How will you work to include Anglophones as we strive to be a truly bilingual country? I know you've touched on the points I'm going to mention and the questions I'm going to ask, but that would be my first question, Monsieur Theberge.
Eh bien, je pense qu'il est important de réaliser.
I think it's important to realize that in Canada, we have official languages communities that are different throughout the country. We have an Anglophone community in Quebec that also faces challenges, and it's important to look at linguistic minorities in Quebec and to say that today they are facing serious challenges, particularly outside of Montreal, where access to services is involved. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues recently at the University of Bishop's University, and the retention rate has remained the same in Quebec, but in regions there is a lack of services. And we've seen that in several regions. The English community in Quebec is facing socioeconomic difficulties. The number of students who speak English in schools is decreasing. But the key now is to figure out how we can serve regions outside of Montreal, whether the eastern regions, Quebec City, or elsewhere. And the Commissioner's role in this respect has some limits. Many events are the result of provincial jurisdiction. Here's one example. We're amalgamating social services and health services, and traditionally these institutions were the result of English leadership in Quebec, so there are fewer and fewer of these. So how can we ensure future leadership? I'd also remind you that once there was Alliance Quebec, and it no longer exists. The Quebec Community Groups Network, and Mr. Shea, one of my colleagues, was the chair. In Quebec, the role of the Commissioner is to defend the interests of linguistic minorities all the time. So that should be his priority. Does this also affect the level of rate of bilingualism in Ontario and elsewhere? We do have an education system where we see the rate of bilingualism increase in Canada. We've invented immersion in Canada, and it has been very successful. And now there's a lack of professors throughout Canada. And immersion has been shown to be the best way to transmit French as a second language. But there are other challenges in this respect. It's at the post-secondary level. It's great to have primary and secondary education in French, but we also have to have access to French programs in college and university, and that is provincial jurisdiction. In British Columbia, at Simon Fraser, in Edmonton, they have the Saint Jean campus. There's also Saint Boniface. There are some institutions, 14 outside of Quebec, in French, but this is one of the challenges we face. Also, for adults, I think we should have access to training. I know the government's thinking about this, but I would encourage you to move forward with an online platform that could be for all Canadians who want to learn either French or English as a second language. And an online platform would allow people to take training at their own speed. So it is training that is the answer to your question. It's the same thing with the public service. We have to have more training, linguistic training opportunities to make sure people can work in French. So bilingualism involves education, and in Canada, we've reached a steady level of Canadians that are bilingual, in Quebec and New Brunswick in particular. So there's work to be done. There's great interest in immersion in Canada, but now we have to make sure that we find teachers to meet this demand. In BC, some people get up at 4 a.m., they go online to enroll their children in immersion schools.
In your opinion, what is the relevance of our two official languages in what has evolved into our multilingual society? You mentioned this in your opening. If you could expand on it, please, in your opinion.
Eh bien, Pardon?
Rapidement, s'il vous plaît.
Very quickly, please. One of the fundamental changes is that there's great diversity now in Canada, notably thanks to immigration. And linguistic duality in Canada that has always been part of the Canadian Federation. But even in the past, we had two languages, French and English. Now, today, there's linguistic duality in a multicultural context. And there were ambitions in the past, but multiculturalism, now we talk about diversity and inclusion more. So how can communities deal with this new reality? Communities have to be able to better welcome immigrants. And now we go to Mr. Vandal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Theberge. As a fellow Franco-Manitoban, it's a pleasure to welcome you here in Ottawa. I know we're not in the House of Commons right now, but we're very close to it. I know that you've worked in the Canadian Francophone community throughout Canada, in Manitoba, in Acadia, in Ontario, but I wanted to discuss your experience in Manitoba first, and more specifically your experience as Deputy Minister of French Language Education in the BEF. As you know, that's a very important issue for Franco-Manitobans, and that's been in the news a great deal lately. So could you describe your role? How you manage to represent the interests of Franco-Manitobans within the government. Thank you very much. First of all, I think it's important to point out the selection process for the deputy minister in Manitoba. It's not just representatives of the government, but members of the community who are there who choose the deputy minister, assistant deputy minister, rather. When you work in an Anglophone apparatus, your role is to explain what the minority Francophone role is. We repeat this often, but it takes a great deal of time before colleagues understand this and absorb this. We always had to look at policy in a Francophone light. I'd always tell the deputy minister or the minister, when you're talking about policy X, Y, Z, you have to look at the impact on the Francophone community. I had a specific mandate, that is to come up with a formula for French language education that would ensure the sustainability of this Francophone division. There is one that is spread over the entire province. So we had to develop a formula for funding to meet those needs. And this was done following discussion with the DFSM and the community. We always had to make sure that we met the needs of the Franco-Manitoban community. Thank you very much. One of your former colleagues talked about the sensitivity for the day-to-day lives of Franco-Manitobans. You became a teacher at what is now St. Boniface University. You mentioned the linguistic crisis in Manitoba, which was a turning point for Franco-Manitobans. And as a member of our community, you experienced all this. We know that the fight for linguistic duality, linguistic rights, continues even today in Manitoba. Could you describe the lessons that you drew from that historic event in Manitoba as it applies to the job that you'll have now? Well, I think that what's important to remember is that at the time, we were hoping to negotiate an amendment to Section 23 of the Manitoba Act. What we wanted was to change the translation of laws that dated back to the 1890s to enshrine French language services. What's important for communities is access to services, being able to create Francophone spaces. What I learned as well is when you begin a court challenge, everything depends on the individual case. The Bilodeau case dealt with regulations appended to legislation. If we went to the Supreme Court and won, it was translation of the regulations. So what I learned is that before you pursue any kind of judicial recourse, you have to really identify the point of the case. One example is in BC. The BC decision, which is a mitigated victory, a certain amount was earmarked for schools, but it's not a system that's equal to the English system. So the danger is choosing a case that doesn't meet the needs, but it was the best tool we had at the time. The Charter of Rights was brand new. We had Article 23 of the Manitoba Act. Today, and since the 80s and 90s, we've seen judiciarization of linguistic rights. A lot of cases have made its way up to the Supreme Court to clarify the impact of Article 23 or Section 16, etc. So it's very important to clarify what all this means, like the Charter, or certain pieces of legislation. What I found out, if we want to go through the courts, we really have to clarify what's at stake and what we want to pursue. Mr. Vandal will now go to the NDP. Ms. Quash. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chairman. Good day, Mr. Theberge. I congratulate you for your nomination. I'd like to get back to Section 49 of the Official Languages Act that stipulates that the Governing Council appoints the commissioner and must consult the leaders of each of the parties. I'd like to know what you understand of when you hear the word consultation. Do they have to have the consent of each party leader, or is it just a suggestion? Well, I don't think I'm in a very good position to discuss this issue of consultation. I went through a process developed by someone else. I understand and I hear this whole discussion about consultation, but I don't think I'm in a very good position to discuss it further. All right. But if you had to consult someone, would you simply provide them with information, or would it be a matter of getting people's opinions? Theoretically, if I consult a community, if I'm chosen as Official Languages Commissioner, let's say, and I consult people, it's to listen to these communities. But when it comes to what you specifically asked, I really don't have a comment. All right, I understand that. You broached the issue of Anglophones in the Office of the Commissioner. I wonder if you know that the only bilingual Anglophone who has a director position within the office is going to retire soon. Do you have a strategy to replace that person? Have you thought of a way to replace him? Well, you've just announced something brand new to me. I'm not the commissioner. I'm not told what's going on in the Office of the Commissioner necessarily, but what's clear is that the Office of the Commissioner has to be representative of the communities it serves. Perhaps one person is not sufficient. I'd like to get back to what I said earlier. The commissioner is there to defend all official language communities, and it's important to have the tools to do that. Thank you. If we get into more detail about the report on the commissioner's strategy, the Official Language Committee recommended in its report on Air Canada that the commissioner be given more teeth, that the government have more teeth, and fine or sanction the airline in some way. What do you think of that, about the commissioner having more powers? I read your report. It was very interesting. But having said that, there are two ways to answer that. First of all, in terms of principle, I think the principle of having a commissioner who has access to tools, because that's what it comes down to, is tools given to the commissioner to ensure the application of the Official Languages Act. From a practical standpoint, you have to figure out what that means exactly. I think that if you read about what's going on today, you say you want it to have more teeth. Well, if you want it to have more teeth, you have to have legislation with teeth. So I think it's important to consider all options, figure out what this means in concrete terms. This is something that has to be studied with the Office of the Commissioner. Well, the Commissioner received many complaints from about many companies, including Air Canada, companies that violated the law in many ways, that even went to court, and there's no penalty in the end. I mentioned on a few occasions that a law without consequences is pointless. With regard to Air Canada, I'd like to make one comment, if you'll allow me. Air Canada is a very strong symbol for Canadians. When Air Canada was privatized, there was a commitment made. Doesn't mean that that has to be changed just because it's many years later. That commitment was made then. It has to be respected. Thank you. One last brief question for my last minute. Do you think Supreme Court judges should be bilingual? Well, once again, two answers. In principle, yes, I believe in it. In practice, to what extent will that represent Canadian diversity on the Supreme Court? I think it's the Supreme Court of all Canadians. So from a practical standpoint, we have to start thinking about what that means exactly. And you think it would be complex in what way? Well, if we look at the last debate about the last appointment, there's the region. There was a discussion about having perhaps an Indigenous judge. Canada's multicultural, so, but it's officially bilingual too. Yes, absolutely. That doesn't mean one can't work with the other. It could be improved then. Thank you. 15 seconds. That's fine. So now we'll go to Mr. Arsenault. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Theberge. I'm very pleased to see you here today. I know you're not yet officially the Official Language Commissioner. You haven't occupied the position yet. So my questions are not traps before you have the files in front of you and the reality of the new job if you are officially appointed. But I was looking at your CV and your background. You've accumulated incredible experience. You have a lot of different talents, and experiences, be it in education in Manitoba and Ontario. You've studied in Quebec in an Anglophone university. So you've experienced that dual reality of Anglophones in Quebec and Francophones outside Quebec. I'd say the quintessence of your experience was at University of Moncton in New Brunswick. I won't say too much about that, of course. I'll be told I'm pretentious, and I'm not. Mr. Theberge, very seriously, you said at the outset, at the beginning of your speech, some words that touched me. This is an essential position. It serves to guarantee the promotion of the rights of minorities and majorities. I don't want to give you a law quiz here, but let's look at the Constitution Act 1982, Section 3. This charter does not limit the powers of Parliament and legislatures to favor the promotion of the status of English or French. So how do you see your role if you officially become Official Language Commissioner, given this section of the Charter, saying it does not limit the power, to see to the progress toward equality of the status and use of French and English? I think that ideally we'd have equal status for English and French in Canada. The reality is that we're very far away from that. I think that when the position of Official Language Commissioner was created, and you create an officer of Parliament, you do so because you've identified an important value. In this case, it was linguistic duality. So that's part of the Canadian Federation. It's always been part of it. However, the status of French and English are not the same. French in Quebec is the language of the majority, but the minority language in North America. English is the minority language in Quebec, but the majority in North America. In the provinces outside Quebec, it's a minority. In some cases, it's extremely tiny. So we have such a long way to go when it comes to equal status for these languages. To do that, we have some tools. We have the Official Languages Act, of course, but it's not enough. We also have the Official Language Action Plan, but that's not enough. What we need is concerted action. As I mentioned earlier, there's the law, there's the action plan, and the law in and of itself is not a bad one. If it was applied as it should be, we might approach equality of French and English. If we look at Part 4, Part 7, Part 5, we see that indeed there are deficiencies. There are voids that are significant. So if we want to proceed toward that ideal equality of French and English in Canada, we have to get the tools we need to achieve that. 2 minutes. So we have to aim for the equality of linguistic minorities and promote this duality and these rights. What I mean is, it doesn't stop at any given point in time. There's always day-to-day work that needs to be done to achieve that linguistic duality anywhere in Canada, whether it's the Constitution Act of 1982 or anything else. But given your experience and your background, your whole adult life, you've been working in this area, what do you think the best tools would be for you? What has your experience taught you that will help you as Commissioner of Official Languages? I think that I'll talk about Francophone minority communities outside Quebec, and the English language minority in Quebec have different realities. But outside Quebec, we always have to value the language of the minority. We have to support it. We always have to give it the resources necessary to ensure its vitality. I have many ways of doing that. The creation of French living space. Vitality is defined as the quality of the interaction you have between citizens in French, strengthening the abilities and capacities of institutions and organizations. Let's say the University of Moncton as an example. Acadia today would not exist without the University of Moncton. 54 years ago, Acadians decided to build a university that transformed the community in 50 years. You need institutions capable of meeting the needs of communities, be it a university like St. Boniface, Faculté Saint-Jean, Simon Fraser, whatever. Institutions have to be solid and serve those communities. Thank you. That's all for Mr. Arsenault. Ms. Lapointe. We'll see if she wants to continue in that vein. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Mr. Desberges, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your presence.
Montreal, and if you are appointed, what is your global knowledge regarding the English-speaking community in Quebec? You already began, but I would like to hear more about that.
Je peux répondre en
Vous pouvez
français?
parler en
OK,
français.
OK, je me demandais. Donc, comme j'ai mentionné au début, il existe.
As I said, at the University of Moncton, we have an institute on linguistic minorities. In our board of directors, we have representatives from the Quebec minority, from universities like Concordia and McGill and so forth. So we already do research on the Anglophone minority in Quebec. In 2013, we published a book by Richard Borossus on the decline of the Anglophone community in Quebec. There were demographic analyses, first of all. As I said, there are significant differences between what goes on in Montreal or outside the city. Well, I'm in the north suburbs. It's not the reality. It's not Montreal. It's different. So what we've noticed is for a number of years now, the number of services, be it health services, social services, are going down for the Anglophone community in Quebec. We've also noted that there's a decline socioeconomically for Anglophone Quebecers. There's a major upheaval in the perception of many Canadians when you talk about the Anglophone community in Quebec. I'm going far back now. We used to talk about Westmount. That's not it anymore. I think we're going to have to work very hard and very closely, the Quebec Community Groups Network, to see how we can do this. I was talking about creating French language living spaces. It's almost the same thing, and we'll have to create these Anglophone spaces. As these services cease to exist, they are part of the vitality of a community, and there's frittering at the edges here, and we've seen this in the West. We've seen that frittering, especially with demographic changes from rural to urban lifestyles and so on. I think that for the Anglophone community of Quebec, there was a session at Bishop's University recently, and young people all said the same thing. They're prepared to stay as long as there are jobs to be had. Most of them are bilingual, but it's a question of opportunities. There are very few Anglophones in the Quebec Public Service, for instance. That doesn't come under the aegis of the Commissioner, but that's just something I've noted.
What would the first thing that you do to make sure that the English community is full of vitality and there are English-speaking spaces? You talked earlier about retention rates and services. We went to Estrie as part of the Official Languages Committee this summer.
Now they are 6%, and this is very large. C'est vrai, c'est très grand. Alors,
So it's very large. What's the first thing you would do? The first thing what I would do would to be go on site, to go there and meet people from the community. It's one thing to read things about communities, but it's another thing to go talk to people and to get their experiences. And I think it's very important that we establish policies and programs that after consultation with people who will be the first ones affected by these programs and policies. So I go back to what you said earlier. You were talking about adults for online trainings, for training for both Anglophones and Francophones. Some people, depending on their generation, have a hard time doing things online, either English or French. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. You talk about improving bilingualism in English and French online, but there's another aspect. Some people have a hard time with literacy. So literacy or illiteracy is a problem in Canada, whether it's in English or French. And when I was at the Ministers' Council, we looked at this problem. I was part of an international group that looked at literacy rates every 5 years. And the rate in Canada hasn't changed in 15 years. We still have a very high level. Higher in rural regions. In Acadia, for example, the illiteracy rate is very high. And what happens, there's a deterioration. After 11th or 12th year, depending on the province, there's a deterioration in abilities because people stop reading. So we have to get people reading again, and it's hard to do that because we have all sorts of programs to encourage people to go back to school and to take courses, but we need community programs, but there aren't enough volunteers. So we have to find a new approach if we want to increase literacy in Canada. Thank you very much. Mr. Genereux. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Théberge, thank you for being with us here today. I just want to give you a bit of context. From the outset, I can tell you that based on your CV and the answers you're giving us, there's no doubt that you have the necessary background for this position based on your career. Nevertheless, if you're here today, it was because there was a fiasco that took place in the spring. And Ms. Mayor was part of this. But I'd like to ask you a few questions, and I would ask you to answer them to the best of your knowledge, of course, because I think it's important. So I would ask you to answer these questions. You seem to be interested when the post became vacant on July 8th. Ms. Mayer removed her candidacy on June 7th. I think you were part of the first cohort of candidates? No, I wasn't there. No. Between June 7th and the 28th of July, you saw everything that happened. Who did you talk to give your name for the position? The Boyden Company. Did you give your name to this company? Yes. You are the one who took the initiative to apply. No one came to scout you. I applied online, and then I was contacted. Perfect. Thanks. If we don't want the same history to repeat itself, we really have to in 7 or 10 years, we have to really look at how things are going today. Inaudible. Obviously, my candidacy wouldn't have been retained. But you talked earlier about the process, and I found it interesting. You seemed to light up when you talked about it. The appointment process for the deputy minister in Manitoba. You said that there were members of the community who were involved in the process. I asked you the question quite sincerely. Do you think it's something we could do going forward when we get communities involved as part of the selection committee for a position? Well, the government positions are only filled at the governmental level, but do you think it would be something we could look at, possibly getting communities involved? Is something you could suggest as a commissioner to avoid the fiasco we saw in the spring? What I can say on this is that I read a lot about what happened. FCA, in particular, is one of the groups. They talked about this process. Is it up to me to talk about this process? I don't know. But clearly, this position, on some levels, is quite crucial. And the future of Anglophone and Francophone minority communities depends on it. Yes, it could be something to look at in the future. With regard to your ability to be at arm's length from the government, well, you went to the external company to be recruited. This was not the case in the past. But do you think you are totally independent with regard to the government that has nominated you? Obviously, we have to nominate someone, but will you be able to criticize the government with regard to its bills and legislation? It's important to answer this question as well. Absolutely. Throughout my career, I worked with conservative governments, Liberals, Neo-Democrat, NDP in Manitoba, and in my opinion, the role that I will take on is to defend and promote linguistic duality in Canada. And if we have to criticize the government or pursue it, that's what we'll do. I can give you something to criticize the government about if you'd like. A little side note here. Our Official Languages Committee works really well together right now. There's no partisan work, and we really work well together. We're going to have another meeting next week. Even though our parties are sometimes reticent, but we really work well together. So as I was saying, this whole government approach that the minister has announced, there were interviews that took place in silo, but now they have a whole government approach. The current reality is that there are departments that keep on saying, oh, it's the fault of the other department. So whether it's a horizontal or a vertical approach, there's no perfect solution, but we have to make sure that every department takes responsibility for official languages. I've been working in this field for quite some time, and I can tell you that in the 80s, we talked about interministerial approaches for minority communities. Nevertheless, the interpreter regrets, but the service is going to be interrupted until the sound improves.
you.